Today, America is coming to help, declared President Obama in his speech last night, giving this reason for targeted U.S. airstrikes against Islamic militants in Iraq.
In recent days, these terrorists have continued to move across Iraq and have neared the city of Erbil, where American diplomats and civilians serve at our consulate and American military personnel advise Iraqi forces. To stop the advance on Erbil, I've directed our military to take targeted strikes against ISIL terrorist convoys should they move toward the city.
Here to help put the situation into context are my guests, SDSU political science professor Rick Epps and former U.S. Navy Lieutenant Barry Landendorf, National Board Director of Veterans for Peace. Welcome back.
Good to see you.
Now, Rick, this time around, the Iraqi government and Kurdish officials asked the U.S. for intervention. What else is different about these airstrikes compared to the ones 10 years ago?
Well, I think what happens here with these airstrikes, the president is really trying, at least politically and publicly, to avert and comfort the American public by saying, hey, we're not going to go any further than this. We're not putting troops on the ground. And what we're going to do is more of a humanitarian act. I think that's where he's starting. I'm concerned about whether he can end there because this is the tip of the iceberg. And in this organization, the Islamic State is much more dangerous, and I think their mission is much more complicated, which I think is going to force our policy to be modified at some point.
And let me have Barry address this. Do you think this is police action, humanitarian action, or is the U.S. actually entering into war?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a police action. What the president did last night in dropping food and water to some of the refugees of the Yazidis religious group that is trapped on this mountaintop, that's humanitarian. The threat to use airstrikes is the potential for entering into war. I mean, when you start to attack a country with the use of the military, and this is a predictable consequence of putting these U.S. troops in there a few months ago. And Veterans for Peace said that's the danger. If you put them into this country and you need to go in and protect them, the first alternative is to use airstrikes. Now, there's some consequences of that. Number one, we don't want to appear to be taking sides in a sectarian civil war, right? So the United States has to avoid that. The other thing is that the ISIS group, the military, is indistinguishable from the civilian population, the way they dress. They're not distinguished. They don't wear uniforms. They don't have any military insignia. So you have a high risk of civilian casualties, which only further will alienate the United States in the Middle East by killing civilians. So there's some alternative things that we ought to be looking at.
And we'll get to that in just a moment. But Rick, I want to ask you, Congress is in recess until September 8th. What's the likelihood that they'll actually come back to cope with this, to make a declaration of war?
I think it depends on what happens on the ground. I think as this situation evolves, we're going to see what actually will, how far they'll have to go. Right now, they're not bringing them back. I think we're at the tip of the iceberg. I think we're at, this is a very dangerous point that we're at right now because, as you say, we've got people on the ground, and in some ways, politically, if you're trying to be able to deal with the situation so the American people could sort of synthesize it, there's a rationale for having those people there because then if anybody is attacked, you have to justify being able to go in and protect them. The American people don't want a war, but the reality of we also can't afford the spread of this extremist Islamic group in that region with access to a vast amount of oil in that north region. It's a real problem. We have a real problem here.
Let's talk about the humanitarian effort for a moment. Obama also authorized American planes to drop food, water, and medical supplies to about 40,000 Yazidi people, many of whom are said to be dying from starvation and illness after they fled the mountains near Mosul to escape Islamic State militants. They were formerly called ISIS militants. Let's hear what Obama said.
In recent days, Yazidi women, men, and children from the area of Sinjar have fled for their lives. And thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, are now hiding high up on the mountain with little but the clothes on their backs. They're without food, they're without water, people are starving, and children are dying of thirst. Meanwhile, ISIL forces below have called for the systematic destruction of the entire Yazidi people, which would constitute genocide.
Now, genocide. My question to both of you, and I'll start with you. Does humanitarian aid include military action against terrorists that are engaging in genocide?
Yes, it can. And this is the slippery slope, though, because it is a humanitarian action because you're trying to protect those people. However, in order to protect them, you've got to engage the militants, Islamic militants, and that becomes a real problem. And that's where the process of war and the escalation, potential escalation, comes in.
And Barry, would you agree with that?
I do agree with it. I think one of the things that that we ought to be considering, what the United States ought to be leading an effort to, is to get the United Nations involved. We need the United Nations involved in a major humanitarian effort. And one of those efforts should be to evacuate these people out of the country, as many as we can. Congress and some of the local San Diego Congress people have already called for giving visas to some of the people in the Christian minorities in Iraq. They're hunkered down in Erbil, and so there are things that we can do in addition to the action of the airstrikes that the president has called for. And I think that's it. And I think you mentioned about Congress leaving. You know, a few weeks ago, Congress passed House Resolution 105, and that specifically said that the president cannot take any military action at all in Iraq unless Congress authorizes that. Well, the president has sidestepped that resolution, and I haven't heard one congressman come out and say anything about that. They've jumped on board the presidential bandwagon, and so this resolution that they so religiously passed with the support, and they know the American people don't want to go back into Iraq. That's why that resolution passed, and so they've simply ignored that.
All right, we are out of time, so there's a lot more about this on our website, kpbs.org. Lieutenant Barry Landendorf and political science professor Rick Epps, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah.